The fire had taken everything. Alawan Hartley remembered the smell first. Always the smell. Acrid and sharp, cutting through the memory like a blade through rotted fabric. She had been 16 when the sickness came to Millhaven, a border town so small it barely appeared on the territorial maps of Raventhorn Vale. The fever swept through in autumn, turning skin gray and lungs to stone, and her father, a blacksmith whose hands had shaped iron into beauty, had been among the first to fall. Her mother lingered 3 years longer, breath rattling in her chest like dice in a cup. Each day a gamble whether she would wake or simply drift into the silence that claimed so many others. Alawan learned to care for her mother with the patience of someone who had no choice. She bathed her when the fever made her delirious, held her hand through the trembling nights, crushed herbs that did nothing but provide the illusion of hope. The neighbors stopped visiting after the first year. Disease carried a stigma in Millhaven, as if poverty and suffering were contagious choices rather than circumstances. The baker's wife crossed to the other side of the street when she saw Elowen approaching. The magistrate's son spat at her feet and called her father a coward for dying. By the time her mother finally surrendered to the sickness, Elowen had grown accustomed to being invisible, a shadow moving through a town that had already buried her in its mind. She was 24 now, and the orphan label clung to her like smoke to wool. There was no inheritance, no family trade to claim, no distant relatives willing to take in a girl with hollow cheeks and hands roughened by years of washing soiled bedclothes. The small cottage her parents had rented was reclaimed by the landlord 3 days after her mother's funeral. Elowen had been given 2 hours to gather what she could carry. She took her mother's wedding ring, a pewter cup her father had made, and a wool blanket that still smelled faintly of lavender. Everything else, every memory pressed into the wooden floors and faded curtains, stayed behind. Millhaven had nothing left for her. The work available to unmarried women without family was brutal and scarce, limited to cleaning stables or mending clothes for merchants who paid in copper so thin it bent in your fingers. Elowen had tried. She scrubbed floors until her knees bled, stitched torn sacks in candlelight until her vision blurred, but the work was never enough. The cost of bread climbed while wages stayed frozen. Winter approached with its teeth bared, and Alawan understood with cold clarity that she would not survive another season in Millhaven. The recruitment notice appeared in the town square on a gray morning in late autumn, nailed to the message board beside announcements of tax increases and public floggings. It was printed on thick parchment, the kind that spoke of wealth and distance, sealed with black wax bearing the sigil of Blackspire Keep. The words were simple and direct. The royal household required temporary domestic staff. Room and board provided. Wages paid monthly in silver. No family ties necessary. Transportation arranged. Alawan read it 3 times, her breath misting in the cold air. Blackspire Keep was a name whispered in Millhaven with a mixture of fear and awe, the fortress carved into the northern mountains where King Alaric Thorn ruled over Raventhorn Vale, and the werewolf packs that bent knee to his authority. Few humans lived in the keep itself, and those who did rarely returned to speak of it. The rumors were vivid and contradictory. Some said the king was a monster who fed on the disobedient. Others claimed he was a brilliant tactician who had brought order to a region once torn by pack wars. Elowen believed none of it, and all of it simultaneously. What she knew for certain was that the notice offered survival, and survival was a luxury she could no longer afford to refuse. She was not the only one desperate enough to apply. 32 people gathered at the inn where the recruitment officer had set up temporary headquarters, most of them young, all of them hollow-eyed with the particular hunger that comes from knowing your next meal is uncertain. The officer was a severe woman in her 50s, dressed in black wool with the Blackspire sigil embroidered on her breast. She examined each applicant with the cold efficiency of someone sorting grain from chaff. She rejected a man with a limp, a woman with missing teeth, a boy who stuttered when asked his age. When she reached Elowen, her gaze lingered. "Experience with the infirm?" the officer asked. 3 years caring for my mother before she passed, Elowen replied. Her voice was steady, though her hands were clasped tightly to keep them from shaking. Bedridden, required assistance with all daily tasks. The officer made a note. "You understand the position is temporary. 3 months, possibly extended depending on performance. You'll be assigned wherever the household requires. The work is difficult. The standards are high. Failure to meet expectations results in immediate dismissal without pay. I understand. You'll leave tomorrow at dawn. Bring only what you can carry. Personal effects are limited. Questions? Eowyn thought of a dozen questions, each one swallowed by the knowledge that asking might cost her the position. She shook her head. You're hired. The cart that took them north was unheated and crowded, packed with 14 newly hired staff and their meager belongings. They traveled for 3 days through landscape that grew progressively harsher, the rolling hills of the border region giving way to forests thick with pine and stone. The road narrowed. The air tasted of snow. On the third evening, Blackspire Keep emerged from the mountains like a tooth jutting from a jaw, all black stone and sharp angles, windows glowing faintly in the gathering dusk. It was not beautiful. It was not welcoming. It was a structure built for dominance, designed to remind anyone who approached that they were entering a place where power was absolute and mercy was optional. The staff entrance was at the rear of the keep, a narrow door that led into a warren of service corridors lit by oil lamps. They were met by the head housekeeper, a tall woman named Mistress Caro, whose expression suggested she had long ago exhausted her capacity for patience. She separated the new hires with swift efficiency, assigning them to kitchens, laundries, stables, and guest quarters. When she reached Eowyn, she paused, consulting a ledger. You're the one with nursing experience? Yes, ma'am. Mistress Caro's mouth tightened. You'll be assigned to the king's personal quarters. He requires constant attendance due to recent injury. You'll be responsible for his daily care, meals, mobility assistance, and ensuring his chambers remain orderly. The position demands discretion, obedience, and absolute reliability. Do you understand? Eowyn's pulse quickened. She had expected to be sent to the kitchens or the laundries, anonymous work that kept her distant from the keep's more dangerous occupants. Being assigned to the king himself was both an opportunity and a threat, the kind of position that could mean better treatment or a faster route to disaster. She had no choice but to accept. I understand. You'll begin tomorrow morning. Another maid will show you to your quarters. Do not wander the keep unsupervised. Do not speak of the king's condition to anyone outside the household. Violations will result in immediate termination and possible charges of treason. Are we clear? Yes, ma'am. The quarters assigned to the king's personal staff were small but private, a luxury Eowyn had not expected. She had a narrow bed, a wooden chest for her belongings, and a window that looked out over the mountain pass. The room was cold, the stone walls offering little insulation against the northern wind, but it was hers, at least for the next 3 months. She unpacked her few possessions, hung her mother's wedding ring on a cord around her neck, and lay down fully clothed on the bed, too exhausted to undress. Sleep came slowly, interrupted by the unfamiliar sounds of the keep, footsteps in distant corridors, the creak of old wood, the low murmur of voices she could not quite discern. She woke before dawn to the sound of a sharp knock on her door. The maid who had shown her to her quarters the night before, a girl named Bryn with nervous hands and a habit of speaking too quickly, stood in the hallway holding a uniform. You're expected in the king's chambers in 30 minutes, Bryn said, thrusting the folded clothing at Eowyn. Dress quickly. Mistress Caro doesn't tolerate lateness. The uniform was simple. A gray wool dress with long sleeves and a white apron, sturdy boots, and a cap to cover her hair. Eowyn dressed quickly, her fingers clumsy with cold and nervousness. Bryn waited in the hallway, fidgeting with the edge of her own apron. What's he like? Eowyn asked as they walked through the maze of corridors toward the king's wing. Bryn's expression shifted, something between pity and discomfort. He's different now. Since the accident. He used to be terrifying, all ice and authority, but now he's just... She trailed off, searching for words. Angry, bitter. He goes through attendance quickly. Most don't last more than a few weeks. He's demanding, and he doesn't tolerate mistakes. What happened to him? Riding accident during a patrol. His horse threw him. They say his spine was shattered. He can't walk now. Needs help with everything. Bryn lowered her voice. Some of the staff think it's made him worse. Like being helpless has turned him cruel. They stopped outside a heavy wooden door flanked by 2 guards in dark armor. Bryn knocked twice, then stepped back, leaving Elowen alone. The door opened from within, and a voice, low and edged with impatience, spoke from the shadows inside. "Come in!" Elowen stepped into the king's chambers, and the door closed behind her with a sound like a verdict. The room was larger than she had anticipated, though the heavy curtains drawn across the windows made it feel smaller, suffocating. A fire burned in the hearth, casting long shadows across stone floors covered in thick rugs. The furniture was dark wood, heavy and imposing, and the air smelled of smoke, leather, and something sharper, medicinal. Near the fireplace sat a wheelchair, and in the wheelchair sat King Alaric Thorne. He was younger than she had expected, no more than his mid-30s, with sharp features that might have been handsome if not for the cold fury etched into every line of his face. His hair was dark, cut short, and his eyes, pale gray, tracked her movement with predatory focus. He wore simple clothing, a dark shirt and trousers, but there was nothing diminished about his presence. Even seated, even supposedly broken, he radiated authority and something more dangerous. A coiled violence that had not been extinguished by injury. "You're the new attendant," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, Your Majesty." Elowen's voice was steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "What's your name?" "Elowen Hartley, Your Majesty." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze moving from her face to her hands, to the way she stood, neither cowering nor defiant, simply waiting. "You've cared for the infirm before." "My mother, for 3 years." "What did she die of?" The question was blunt, almost cruel, but Elowen had learned long ago that grief was not a wound to be protected. Wasting sickness. Her lungs failed. "Did you prolong her suffering? Or did you have the mercy to let her go?" Elowen's jaw tightened. "I did everything I could to ease her pain. She chose when to stop fighting." Something flickered in Alaric's expression, too brief to name. "I don't need coddling. I don't need pity. I need someone competent who can follow instructions without excessive sentiment." "Can you do that?" "Yes, Your Majesty." "We'll see." He gestured toward a low table near the wheelchair. "My morning routine begins at dawn. Breakfast is prepared by the kitchen staff and brought here. You'll serve it. I require assistance transferring from the chair to the bed and back. My chambers are to be kept orderly but not fussed over. I don't tolerate gossip, incompetence, or interference. If you last 2 weeks, you'll have outlasted the previous 3 attendants. Do you have questions?" Elowen had 1,000 questions, but she recognized the tone of someone who did not actually want answers. "No, Your Majesty." "Good. Breakfast should arrive shortly. Don't hover." She nodded and stepped back, positioning herself near the door where she could respond quickly if needed, but remained out of his immediate line of sight. Alaric returned his attention to a stack of papers on the small table beside him, his jaw tight as he read. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the faint scratch of his pen as he made notes in the margins. Elowen watched him carefully, not staring but observing, the way she had learned to observe her mother for signs of distress or need. There were inconsistencies, small things that did not align with what Bryn had told her. The way his shoulders moved when he reached for a paper suggested strength, not atrophy. The muscles in his forearms were defined, not wasted. When he shifted his weight in the chair, the movement was controlled, deliberate, not the awkward adjustment of someone whose body no longer obeyed. She said nothing, filed the observations away, and waited. The knock on the door announced the arrival of breakfast. A young man in kitchen livery entered with a tray, set it on the table near Alaric, and left without speaking. Elowen moved forward at Alaric's gesture, lifting the tray and bringing it closer. The meal was substantial: bread and cold meat, cheese, and a pot of strong tea, far more than the staff meals she had been given the night before. "Serve it," Alaric said, his tone flat. Elowen arranged the food on a plate, poured the tea, and placed everything within his reach. He ate without comment, his movements efficient, and she returned to her position by the door. The routine continued through the morning. She assisted him in transferring from the wheelchair to the bed, a process that required her to support his weight while he maneuvered himself. His body was solid, heavier than she had anticipated, and she felt the strength in his grip even as he pretended helplessness. He did not thank her. He did not acknowledge her effort beyond a curt nod. By midday, Alawan had cleaned his chambers, changed the linens, and prepared his lunch. Alaric spent most of the time reading or staring into the fire, his expression unreadable. He spoke rarely, and when he did, it was to issue instructions or ask blunt questions that felt more like tests than genuine curiosity. She responded with the same measured calm she had used with her mother, neither warm nor cold, simply present. It was late afternoon when he finally addressed her directly again. "You're quieter than the others." Alawan glanced up from folding a blanket. "I didn't think you wanted conversation, Your Majesty." "I don't, but most people can't help themselves. They either fawn or flinch. You do neither. I'm here to work, not to entertain." His mouth twitched, something that might have been the ghost of a smile or simple irritation. "You're not afraid of me." "I didn't say that, but you're not." He tilted his head, studying her. "Why?" Alawan considered her answer carefully. "Fear doesn't make the work easier. It just makes mistakes more likely." Alaric leaned back in his chair, his gaze still fixed on her. "You've worked for difficult people before. Everyone I've worked for has been difficult in their own way. And you survived. I survived." He said nothing more, turning his attention back to the fire. But Alawan felt the weight of his scrutiny even after he looked away. She finished her tasks in silence, and when evening came, she helped him prepare for bed, a process that involved more physical contact than she was comfortable with, but which she handled with the same clinical efficiency she had used with her mother. He did not speak during the transfer, but his eyes never left her face, watching, always watching. When she finally left his chambers and returned to her small room, Alawan sat on the edge of her bed and exhaled slowly. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from exhaustion and the strange tension of the day. She thought of Bryn's warning, that most attendants did not last more than a few weeks. She thought of the inconsistencies she had noticed, the strength in Alaric's body that did not match the story of a shattered spine. She thought of the way he watched her, not with the helplessness of an invalid, but with the calculating focus of a predator. Something was wrong. Something was being hidden. And Alawan, who had spent years learning to read the unspoken signals of a dying woman, knew that the truth, whatever it was, would eventually surface. She only hoped she would be prepared when it did. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Alawan woke before dawn, dressed in the gray uniform, and arrived at Alaric's chambers to begin the morning routine. She served his meals, assisted with his mobility, maintained the order of his rooms, and spoke only when spoken to. Alaric remained distant, his demeanor cold and demanding, but he did not dismiss her. Days turned into a week, and the week stretched into 2. She outlasted the previous attendants without understanding exactly why. The keep itself was a place of secrets. Alawan learned quickly that the staff did not speak openly about the king's condition or the circumstances of his accident. Conversations stopped when certain names were mentioned. Guards stood at doorways that led to wings of the keep she was forbidden to enter. At night, she heard sounds that did not belong to any human household. Low growls and the scrape of claws on stone. Reminders that Blackspire Keep was not merely a royal residence, but the seat of a werewolf king. Bryn, who had become something close to a friend in the lonely isolation of the keep, warned her to keep her head down. "The court is dangerous right now," she whispered one evening as they ate together in the staff dining hall. "There are factions, people positioning themselves in case the king doesn't recover. Some think he's weak now, vulnerable." "Do you think that?" Alawan asked. Bryn hesitated. "I don't know. He's different, but he's not broken. Not really. Sometimes I think..." She trailed off, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "Sometimes I think he's waiting for something." Alawan thought of the way Alaric watched her, the tests disguised as questions, the moments when his supposed weakness slipped and revealed something harder beneath. Waiting for what? "I don't know, but I hope we're not here when he finds it." That night, Elowen lay awake in her small room, staring at the ceiling and listening to the wind howl outside. She thought of her mother, the way illness had stripped away everything but the core of who she was, leaving behind only honesty and exhaustion. She thought of Millhaven, the town that had buried her while she was still breathing. She thought of Alaric, the king who pretended to be broken while his eyes burned with something that was very much alive. And she understood with a clarity that was both frightening and strangely comforting that she had not come to Blackspire Keep to care for an invalid. She had come to bear witness to something far more dangerous, a reckoning, a revelation, a truth that had been carefully hidden and was now waiting, coiled and patient, for the right moment to strike. She did not know what role she would play in that revelation. She only knew that survival, the thing she had fought for every day since her mother's death, would require more than obedience and silence. It would require seeing what others refused to see. And Elowen, who had spent years watching someone die slowly, had learned to see everything. The third week began with snow. It fell silent and heavy, blanketing the mountains and turning Blackspire Keep into an island of stone surrounded by white. The temperature plummeted, and even the thick walls of the fortress could not keep out the cold that seeped through cracks and settled in corners. Elowen woke to frost on the inside of her window, her breath misting in the air as she dressed quickly and made her way through corridors lit by torches that guttered in drafts she could not see. Alaric's chambers were warmer than the rest of the keep, the fire always burning, always tended by staff who came and went like ghosts. He was awake when she entered, seated in his wheelchair near the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape. He did not acknowledge her arrival, and Elowen moved through the morning routine with practiced efficiency, setting out his breakfast, checking the fire, preparing fresh linens. She had learned his patterns over the past weeks, the silences that meant he wanted to be left alone, the subtle shifts in posture that indicated pain or discomfort, the moments when his attention sharpened and he watched her with that predatory focus that made her skin prickle. Today, he was restless. She could see it in the tension of his shoulders, the way his fingers drummed against the arm of the wheelchair, the frequency with which his gaze moved from the window to the door to her and back again. Something had changed, some invisible pressure building within the keep's walls, and Elowen felt it like the charge in the air before a storm. "Tell me about Millhaven," Alaric said suddenly, breaking the silence that had stretched through breakfast. Elowen paused in her task of clearing his plate. "What would you like to know, Your Majesty? What made you leave?" It was not the question she had expected, though she should have anticipated it. Alaric's questions were always calculated, designed to probe for weakness or truth or both. She chose her words carefully. "There was nothing left for me there. No family, no work, no future. So you came here. The position was offered. I accepted. To serve a crippled king in a fortress full of monsters." Elowen met his gaze directly. "To survive." Something flickered in his expression, gone before she could name it. "Honest. I appreciate that." He turned back to the window. "Most people lie to me now. They think I'm too weak to notice or too broken to care. Are you?" The question hung in the air between them, dangerous and deliberate. Alaric's head turned slowly, his pale eyes fixing on her with an intensity that made her want to step back, but she held her ground. For a long moment, he said nothing, simply studied her as if seeing her for the first time. "No," he said finally, his voice low. "I'm not." Elowen nodded once, acknowledging the admission without pushing further. She returned to her work, and Alaric returned to the window. But the atmosphere in the room had shifted, become charged with something unspoken. She understood that she had crossed a line, asked a question that no servant should ask a king, but she also understood that Alaric had wanted her to ask it. He had been waiting for someone to see past the performance. The morning passed in silence, but it was a different silence now, less hostile and more contemplative. Alaric worked on correspondence, his handwriting sharp and precise, while Elowen organized the small library of books stacked near his desk. She noticed the titles: treatises on military strategy, histories of pack wars, volumes on law and governance. These were not the readings of a man resigned to helplessness. They were the tools of someone preparing for something. It was mid-afternoon when the knock came at the door. 3 sharp raps followed by the entrance of a man Elowin had not seen before. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in the formal attire of the court, his hair silver gray and his face weathered with age and authority. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who had spent decades in power, and when he looked at Alaric, there was something in his gaze that was both deferential and calculating. "Your Majesty," the man said, bowing slightly. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Counselor Brennan." Alaric's voice was neutral, revealing nothing. "I wasn't expecting you. I thought it prudent to check on your progress. The council is concerned about your recovery." His eyes moved briefly to Elowin, assessing and dismissing her in a single glance. "Perhaps we should speak privately." "My attendant stays," Alaric said. "She's discreet." Brennan's mouth tightened, but he nodded. "As you wish." He moved closer, lowering his voice, though Elowin could still hear every word. "There have been developments. The southern packs are growing restless. They see your condition as an opportunity. There are whispers of challenges, questions about succession. The council believes it may be time to consider appointing a regent, someone to handle the day-to-day governance while you focus on recovery." "A regent," Alaric repeated, his tone flat. "How generous of the council to think of my well-being." "We only want what's best for the kingdom, Your Majesty." "And who does the council suggest for this position?" Brennan hesitated, and in that hesitation, Elowin saw the answer before he spoke. "Several names have been discussed. Councillor Thaddeus has extensive experience. Councillor Marin has strong ties to the northern packs. The decision would ultimately be yours, of course, but the council stands ready to support whatever choice you make." "How reassuring." Alaric leaned back in his wheelchair, his expression unreadable. "Tell the council I appreciate their concern, but I'm not ready to abdicate my responsibilities. I'm recovering. Slowly, but recovering. A regent won't be necessary. With respect, Your Majesty, the recovery has been progressing for 3 months with little visible improvement. The kingdom requires strong leadership, and if you're unable to provide it, I am providing it," Alaric interrupted, his voice sharp enough to cut. "From this chair, from this room, I am still your king." If the council has forgotten that, perhaps they need a reminder. Brennan's jaw tightened, but he bowed again. "Of course, Your Majesty. I meant no disrespect. I'll convey your decision to the council." "You do that." The councillor left without another word, and the door closed behind him with a heavy thud. Alaric remained still, staring at the place where Brennan had stood, his hands gripping the arms of the wheelchair with enough force that his knuckles whitened. Elowin said nothing, waiting for the tension to break. "They're circling," Alaric said finally, his voice low and bitter, like vultures, "waiting for me to weaken enough that they can justify tearing the kingdom apart. Are they wrong to be concerned?" Elowin asked carefully. Alaric's gaze snapped to her. "What do you mean?" "You said you're not broken, but they don't know that. All they see is a king who can't walk, can't defend himself, can't rule from the throne. If you want them to stop circling, you need to show them they're wrong. And how do you suggest I do that without revealing that I've been lying to them for 3 months?" Elowin considered the question, weighing her words. "You don't reveal everything. You reveal enough. Small improvements. A return to public appearances. Decisions that remind them you're still capable of ruling. You make them second-guess their assumptions without confirming their suspicions." Alaric stared at her, and for the first time since she had entered his service, she saw something like surprise in his expression. "You've thought about this. I've had time to think about a lot of things. You're smarter than you pretend to be. I could say the same about you, Your Majesty." A sound escaped him, something between a laugh and a growl. "Careful, Elowin. Honesty is dangerous in this court. You asked for it." "I did." He turned back to the window, his expression thoughtful. "Leave me. I need to think." Elowin bowed and retreated from the chambers, her heart racing. She had spoken too freely, crossed too many lines, but Alaric had not dismissed her. If anything, he had seemed almost pleased by her bluntness. It was a dangerous game, this dance of truth and performance, and Elowin was not certain she understood all the rules. The corridors of the keep were cold and dim as she made her way back to her quarters. She passed other servants, guards, members of the household staff who moved through their duties with heads down and voices low. No one met her eyes. No one spoke unless necessary. The atmosphere of Blackspire Keep had always been oppressive, but in recent days it had become suffocating, as if the stone walls themselves were holding their breath. Bryn was waiting in Alowan's room when she returned, perched on the edge of the narrow bed with her hands twisted in her apron. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "What happened?" Alowan asked, closing the door behind her. "They're arresting people," Bryn whispered. "3 guards and a kitchen worker. They're being accused of sedition, plotting against the king." Alowan's stomach dropped. "When?" "This morning. They were taken to the lower cells. No one knows what evidence they have, but Mistress Caro said it's serious. She said more arrests might follow." Bryn looked up at Alowan, her eyes wet. "What if they come for us? What if they think we're involved?" "We're not involved. That doesn't always matter. You know that." Alowan did know that. She had seen enough false accusations in Millhaven, enough scapegoating when someone needed to be blamed, to understand that innocence was not always a defense. She sat down beside Bryn, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Stay quiet. Do your work. Don't draw attention. That's all we can do." "Ah, what if it's not enough?" "Then we deal with it when it happens." Bryn nodded, though she did not look reassured. She left a few minutes later, and Alowan was alone again, staring at the cold stone walls and wondering what she had walked into. The arrests, the counselor's visit, the tension coiling tighter every day. It all pointed to something building, a confrontation that would not be avoided much longer. And Alowan, who had come to Blackspire Keep simply to survive, found herself standing at the center of it, closer to the king than anyone except his most trusted guards. She thought of her mother, the way she had faced her death with quiet dignity, refusing to let fear dictate her final days. Alowan had inherited that stubbornness, that refusal to be broken by circumstances beyond her control. She did not know what was coming, but she knew she would face it the same way she had faced everything else, with her eyes open and her spine straight. The next morning, Alaric was different. The restlessness was gone, replaced by a cold, focused intensity that reminded Alowan of a blade being sharpened. He said nothing about the arrests, but she knew he was aware. The way he read the reports brought to him, the questions he asked the guards who came and went, the letters he wrote and sealed with black wax, all of it spoke of a man preparing for war. "You'll accompany me today," he said as she served his breakfast. Alowan paused. "Your Majesty? I'm making a public appearance. The council needs to see that I'm still capable. You'll assist me. Where are we going?" "The throne room. There's a petition hearing scheduled for midday. I intend to preside." Alowan's pulse quickened. A public appearance meant exposure, meant being seen by the entire court, meant stepping into the heart of whatever power struggle was unfolding in Blackspire Keep. She nodded, keeping her expression neutral. "I'll be ready." The throne room was a vast space of dark stone and high ceilings, dominated by the obsidian throne that sat on a raised dais at the far end. Torches burned in iron sconces along the walls, casting flickering shadows that made the room feel alive and watchful. When Alowan wheeled Alaric into the hall, a hush fell over the assembled court. Nobles and council members, guards and petitioners, all turned to watch as the king entered for the first time in weeks. Alaric sat straight in the wheelchair, his expression carved from ice, his pale eyes sweeping over the crowd with the authority of someone who had never stopped being a predator. Alowan positioned the chair near the throne, close enough for Alaric to see and be seen, and then stepped back to stand just behind him, her hands folded and her gaze lowered. She could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her, curious and suspicious, wondering who she was and why she had been brought into this gathering. The hearing began. Petitioners came forward one by one, presenting grievances and requests, disputes over land and resources, appeals for justice. Alaric listened to each one with focused attention, asking sharp questions, making decisions that were swift and decisive. His voice carried through the hall, cold and commanding, and Alowan saw the way the court reacted, the subtle shift in posture, the way even the most powerful nobles straightened when he spoke. This was not a weakened king. This was a ruler who had never stopped ruling, and the message was clear. Counselor Brennan stood near the front of the hall, his expression carefully neutral, but Elowen saw the tension in his jaw, the way his hands clenched and released at his sides. He had expected Alaric to remain hidden, to continue the charade of helplessness. This public display was a direct challenge to the council's machinations, and everyone in the room understood it. The hearing lasted 2 hours. By the end, Alaric's face was drawn with exhaustion, though he hid it well. When the final petitioner was dismissed, he gestured to Elowen, and she moved forward to wheel him out of the hall. The court parted to let them pass, and Elowen felt the weight of their scrutiny follow them all the way to the corridor. Once they were alone, Alaric exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging slightly. "Get me back to my chambers." "Yes, Your Majesty." They moved through the corridors in silence, and when they reached his rooms, Elowen helped him transfer from the wheelchair to the bed. His body was heavy, his movements less controlled than usual, and she realized that the appearance had taken more out of him than he wanted to admit. She said nothing, simply ensured he was settled before stepping back. "You did well," Alaric said, his voice rough. "I didn't do anything, Your Majesty. You kept your composure. That's more than most would manage." He closed his eyes, his jaw tight. "The council will push back. They'll see this as a provocation. Isn't that what you wanted?" "Yes, but it also makes things more dangerous. For everyone." He opened his eyes, looking at her directly. "You should know what you're caught in the middle of. This isn't just about governance. It's about survival. Mine and the kingdom's. The council is divided, some loyal, some opportunistic, and some outright treasonous. I've been watching them, testing them, waiting to see who shows their hand. The arrests this morning were the beginning. More will follow. Are they guilty? Does it matter?" Elowen held his gaze. "Yes." Alaric's mouth twitched. "Then yes, they're guilty. Caught passing information to rival packs, planning sabotage. But the arrests also serve another purpose. They send a message. I'm still watching. I'm still in control. And anyone who thinks otherwise will pay for that mistake. And what happens when you reveal the truth? That you've been pretending this whole time? Then I either consolidate power completely, or I trigger a coup that tears the kingdom apart." He looked away, staring at the ceiling. "Either way, the pretense ends soon, one way or another." Elowen said nothing, but her mind raced. She understood now what Brynn had meant when she said Alaric was waiting for something. He was waiting for the right moment to strike, to reveal the deception and use it to purge the disloyal from his court. It was a plan born of paranoia and necessity, brilliant and ruthless in equal measure. And Elowen, who had simply wanted to survive, had become a witness to it. That night, she lay in her narrow bed and stared at the darkness, listening to the wind howl outside. She thought of Millhaven, of the life she had left behind, of the poverty and helplessness that had driven her to this place. She thought of her mother's wedding ring, cold against her chest, a reminder of survival and loss. She thought of Alaric, the king who pretended to be broken while sharpening his claws in secret. And she realized, with a clarity that was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating, that she was no longer just trying to survive. She was part of something larger, something dangerous and significant. She had crossed a threshold without realizing it, and there was no going back now. Whatever came next, she would face it. Not because she was brave, but because she had nowhere else to go. The 4th week brought more arrests. Guards, servants, even a low-ranking noble, all taken in the night and dragged to the cells beneath Blackspire Keep. The staff moved through their duties with heads down and mouths shut, afraid that any word or gesture might be misconstrued as disloyalty. Mistress Caro's face was drawn and pale, her orders sharp and clipped. Even Brynn, normally so talkative, had gone silent, her hands trembling as she worked. Elowen continued her duties in Alaric's chambers, the only place in the keep that felt both safer and more dangerous than anywhere else. Alaric himself was a study in contradictions. Some days he was cold and withdrawn, spending hours staring at reports and correspondence, his expression grim. Other days, he was almost conversational, asking her questions about her past, her opinions on trivial matters, testing the boundaries of their strange relationship. "Do you regret coming here?" he asked one afternoon as she organized his books. Elawan considered the question. "I don't know yet." An honest answer. "You seem to prefer those." "I do." He watched her for a moment. "Most people who come to Blackspire keep either love it or hate it immediately. You seem indifferent." "I'm not indifferent. I'm cautious." "Smart." He leaned back in his chair. "Tell me, if you could leave right now, go anywhere, would you?" "Where would I go? Millhaven has nothing for me. I have no money, no prospects. Leaving would just be trading one form of survival for another. So you're trapped here." "No more than you are, Your Majesty." Alaric laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Fair point." The conversation ended there. But Eowyn felt the shift between them, a grudging respect that had not existed before. She did not understand why Alaric tolerated her bluntness, why he allowed her to speak to him in ways that would have earned anyone else punishment or dismissal. Perhaps it was because she was insignificant, a human servant with no power or influence. Or perhaps it was because he was lonely, isolated by his deception and the paranoia that came with it. That evening, as Eowyn prepared to leave his chambers, Alaric stopped her with a gesture. "There's going to be a confrontation soon. Within days, possibly sooner. The council is planning something. I can feel it. What will you do?" "What I've been planning to do since the beginning. End this." He looked at her, his expression serious. "When it happens, stay in your quarters. Don't come to my chambers. Don't try to help. Just stay out of sight until it's over. And if it doesn't go the way you expect, then it won't matter where you are." Eowyn nodded slowly. "I understand." "Good." He turned away, dismissing her. She left the chambers and walked back through the cold corridors, her mind racing. A confrontation was coming, a reckoning that would determine the fate of the kingdom and everyone in it. And Eowyn, who had come to Blackspire Keep with nothing but a desperate need to survive, found herself hoping, against all reason, that Alaric would win. Not because she believed in him as a king, not because she thought he was just or kind, but because he had given her something no one else in her life had given her in a long time. He had seen her, not as a servant or a tool or a burden, but as a person capable of thought and judgment. And that recognition, small and fragile as it was, mattered more than she wanted to admit. The snow continued to fall outside, burying the world in silence. And inside Blackspire Keep, the storm was gathering. The confrontation came 3 nights later, not with fanfare, but with silence. Elawan woke to the absence of sound, a stillness so complete it pressed against her ears like water. No wind, no footsteps in distant corridors, no murmur of voices or clatter of kitchen work preparing for dawn. Just silence, thick and waiting. She rose from her bed, pulse quickening, and moved to the door. The corridor outside was empty, the torches burning low, casting long shadows that seemed to shift and breathe. Something was wrong. Every instinct she had honed through years of watching her mother's illness, learning to read the smallest changes in breathing and color, screamed that something fundamental had shifted in the keep. Alaric had told her to stay in her quarters, to wait, to hide. But Eowyn had never been good at following orders when her survival instincts told her otherwise. And right now, those instincts were telling her that staying locked in a small room while chaos unfolded was the fastest route to being forgotten or eliminated. She dressed quickly, pulled on her boots, and slipped into the corridor. The keep was a maze at night, all identical stone passages and doors that led to storage rooms or dead ends. She moved carefully, keeping to the shadows, avoiding the main hallways where guards would be stationed. She did not have a destination in mind, only a need to understand what was happening, to see with her own eyes rather than waiting blind and helpless. She heard them before she saw them. Voices, low and urgent, coming from a corridor that led toward the council chambers. Elawan pressed herself against the wall and edged closer, straining to make out words. Can't wait any longer. The king's appearance in the throne room changed nothing. He's still weak, still vulnerable. You're certain the guards are with us? Most of them. The ones who aren't have been reassigned or removed. By the time anyone realizes what's happening, it'll be done. And if he resists, he's a cripple in a wheelchair. What resistance can he offer? Elowen's blood went cold. This was it. The coup Alaric had been waiting for. The moment when his enemies would show themselves completely. She needed to warn him. She turned to retreat back the way she had come, and nearly collided with a figure standing in the shadows behind her. Her breath caught, but before she could scream, a hand clamped over her mouth and she was pulled backward into an alcove. She struggled, panic flooding through her, until a familiar voice hissed in her ear. "Stop! It's me! Bryn." Elowen sagged with relief as the hand released her. She turned to face her friend, whose face was pale and terrified in the dim torchlight. "What are you doing here?" Elowen whispered. "I could ask you the same thing. I couldn't sleep. I heard people moving in the corridors and I followed them." Bryn's hands were shaking. "Elowen, something terrible is about to happen. We need to get out of here, find somewhere to hide until it's over. I need to warn the king." "Are you insane? You'll get yourself killed. This isn't our fight." "He needs to know. He already knows," Bryn interrupted, her voice sharp with fear. "Don't you see? This is what he's been waiting for. He's probably been expecting this for weeks. You going there won't change anything except get you caught in the middle of it." Elowen hesitated. Bryn was right. Alaric had been orchestrating this entire situation, testing his court, waiting for his enemies to reveal themselves. He had known this confrontation was coming. He had prepared for it. But something in Elowen could not accept staying hidden while the man who had given her purpose, however strange and dangerous, faced his enemies alone. "I have to go," she said quietly. "Then you're a fool." Bryn's eyes filled with tears. "And I won't watch you die." She turned and fled down the corridor, her footsteps echoing briefly before fading into silence. Elowen stood alone, heart pounding, and made her choice. She moved quickly through the passages, taking service corridors that wound toward the king's wing. She passed storage rooms and empty guard posts, evidence of the conspiracy that had been carefully arranged. The guards who should have been protecting Alaric had been reassigned, just as the conspirators had said. He was isolated, vulnerable, exactly as they wanted him. The door to Alaric's chambers was closed, but not locked. Elowen pushed it open and slipped inside, closing it quietly behind her. The room was dark, except for the dying fire in the hearth, casting just enough light to see the wheelchair sitting empty near the window. "I told you to stay in your quarters." Elowen spun around. Alaric stood near the bed, fully upright, his posture straight and strong, no trace of weakness or injury. In the firelight, she could see him clearly for the first time, not as the pretend invalid she had been caring for, but as what he truly was. A predator, a king, a werewolf alpha whose power radiated from him like heat. "They're coming," Elowen said, finding her voice. "The council. They're planning to—" "I know." Alaric moved toward her with fluid grace, and Elowen realized she had never seen him walk before. Not truly. Every movement was controlled, economical, the gait of someone who had spent a lifetime learning to use his body as a weapon. "They've been planning this for weeks. I've been counting on it." "You knew." "Of course I knew. I've been feeding them information, creating opportunities, making myself appear more vulnerable than I am." He stopped a few feet away from her, his pale eyes catching the firelight. "This is the endgame, Elowen. Tonight, the traitors reveal themselves completely, and I deal with them permanently. They think you're helpless. They're going to come here expecting an invalid they can remove without a fight. I know." A cold smile touched his lips. "They're going to be disappointed." The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside cut off whatever Elowen might have said next. Many footsteps, moving with purpose. Alaric's expression sharpened, his head tilting slightly as if listening to something beyond normal hearing. When he spoke again, his voice was low and commanding. "Get behind me. Stay quiet. No matter what happens, do not interfere." Elowen obeyed, moving to the far side of the room near the fireplace. Her legs felt weak, her pulse thundering in her ears. She had wanted to warn him, to help somehow. But now that the moment had arrived, she felt utterly useless. A human woman with no power facing whatever was about to unfold. The door burst open. 6 men entered, all of them members of the council she had seen in the throne room, Counselor Brennan at their front. They carried no weapons openly, but the threat was clear in their postures, in the way they fanned out to surround the wheelchair that sat empty near the window. Brennan's eyes found the chair first, then swept the room, landing on Alaric standing upright near the bed. For a moment, pure shock registered on his face, followed quickly by calculation and fury. "So," Brennan said slowly, his voice tight, "the crippled king walks." "I was never crippled," Alaric replied, his tone conversational. "But you knew that, didn't you? Deep down. You suspected. That's why you moved so carefully, why you took so long to act. You were never quite certain. You lied to your own court. I tested my own court, and you failed." Alaric's voice hardened. "You and every other ambitious fool who saw my supposed weakness as an opportunity rather than the trap it was." Brennan's jaw clenched. "You've been playing games while the kingdom suffered. The southern packs are in chaos. Our alliances are fracturing. And you sat here in your chambers, pretending to be helpless, watching your own people struggle. The kingdom is stronger than you give it credit for. And the only ones who have suffered are the traitors I've been identifying and removing." Alaric took a step forward, and Eowyn saw something ripple beneath his skin, a shimmer of power that made her breath catch. "Did you think I didn't know about your correspondence with the Shadowfen pack? About the weapons shipments you arranged through your nephew? About the guards you bribed and the intelligence you sold?" Brennan's face paled. "You have no proof. I have all the proof I need. Confessions from your co-conspirators, documents seized from your private chambers, witnesses who watched you commit treason." Alaric's eyes glowed faintly in the firelight, no longer entirely human. "You're done, Brennan. You and everyone who stood with you. We're not done yet." Brennan's voice turned hard, desperate. "You may be standing, but you're still alone. Isolated. We have the guards. We have the numbers. You can't fight all of us." "Can't I?" The transformation happened so fast, Eowyn almost missed it. One moment, Alaric was standing there in human form. The next, he was something else entirely. Larger, more powerful, his body shifting and expanding in ways that should have been impossible. Fur rippled across his skin, his face elongating into a muzzle, his hands becoming claws. He dropped to all fours, and the creature that stood where the king had been was massive. A wolf the size of a bear with eyes that burned like silver fire. The counselors stumbled backward, fear replacing calculation. Brennan shouted something, a command that was lost in the sudden chaos as Alaric lunged forward. The room exploded into violence. Eowyn pressed herself against the wall, hands over her mouth to keep from screaming, as the werewolf king tore through the men who had come to depose him. It was not a fight. It was an execution. Alaric moved with terrifying speed and precision, claws raking across flesh, jaws closing around throats. Blood sprayed across the stone floor, across the furniture, across the walls. The counselors tried to flee, but the door was blocked by Alaric's bulk, and there was nowhere to run in the enclosed space. Their screams echoed through the chambers, raw and desperate, cut short one by one. Brennan was the last to die. He had managed to draw a knife from his belt, but it was a pathetic defense against the creature bearing down on him. Alaric caught him by the throat, lifted him off the ground, and held him there as the counselor choked and struggled. When he spoke, Alaric's voice was distorted, inhuman, but the words were clear. "This is what happens to traitors in my kingdom." He crushed Brennan's throat with a single squeeze and dropped the body to the floor. The silence that followed was deafening. Eowyn stood frozen, her back pressed against the wall, staring at the carnage that filled the king's chambers. 6 bodies lay crumpled and broken, blood pooling beneath them, steam rising in the cold air. And in the center of it all, the massive werewolf stood, breathing heavily, its fur matted with gore. Slowly, the creature began to shift again, shrinking and reforming until Alaric stood there in human shape once more, naked and covered in blood. He looked at the bodies with cold satisfaction, then turned his gaze to Eowyn. She could not move, could not speak, could barely breathe. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get as far from this room and this man as possible, but her legs would not obey. She simply stood there, shaking, staring at the king who had just slaughtered 6 men with his bare hands. "You shouldn't have come here," Alaric said quietly. His voice was hoarse, tired. "I warned you to stay away." "I thought—" Elowen's voice cracked. She swallowed and tried again. "I thought you needed help." "I didn't need help. I needed witnesses to know what happened here. That the traitors tried to kill me and failed. That the king is stronger than they believed." He looked down at himself, at the blood covering his skin. "But I didn't need you to witness this specifically. What are you going to do now? Clean up? Dispose of the bodies? Make an announcement to the court that the conspiracy has been dealt with?" He moved toward a basin of water near the bed, beginning to wash the blood from his hands with methodical efficiency. "You should go. Return to your quarters. Say nothing about what you saw here tonight. If anyone asks, you were asleep and heard nothing." Elowen's mind was reeling, struggling to process everything she had witnessed. The deception, the violence, the cold calculation with which Alaric had orchestrated and executed this purge. He had used his own supposed weakness as bait, drawing his enemies into a trap where they had no chance of survival. It was brilliant and brutal in equal measure. "They trusted you," she said, the words escaping before she could stop them. "The court, the council, they believed you were injured. They believed what I wanted them to believe. That's what power is, Elowen. Control over perception as much as reality." He dried his hands and pulled on a robe, covering the worst of the blood. Trust is a tool like any other. It can be used or broken depending on what's required. "And what about me?" The question came out small, frightened. "Do you trust me?" Alaric turned to look at her fully, his expression unreadable. "I don't trust anyone, but you've proven yourself more loyal than most, even if you're too stubborn to follow simple instructions." He paused. "You could have run. Could have let them kill me and claimed ignorance. Instead, you came to warn me, even though you knew it was dangerous. I didn't know you could—" She gestured helplessly at the room, at the bodies. "Transform? Kill 6 men in under a minute? No, I suppose you wouldn't." He moved closer, and Elowen forced herself not to flinch. "You've seen what I am now, what I'm capable of. Most humans who witness a werewolf transformation don't recover from the shock. They either go mad or spend the rest of their lives terrified. Which will you be?" Elowen met his eyes, forcing herself to hold his gaze despite the fear coursing through her veins. She thought of her mother, dying slowly while the town turned its back. She thought of Millhaven, the casual cruelty of people who had power over those who had none. She thought of the counselors who had plotted to murder Alaric, not because he was cruel or unjust, but because they saw opportunity in his supposed weakness. "Neither," she said quietly. "I've seen cruelty before. I've seen people destroy each other for power and position. What you did tonight was violent, but it wasn't senseless. They came here to kill you. You defended yourself. Is that what you think this was? Self-defense? Wasn't it?" Alaric studied her for a long moment. "You're either very brave or very naive. I'm neither. I'm just someone who understands that survival sometimes requires violence." Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the cold mask he wore. "Get out of here, Elowen, before I change my mind about letting you leave." She did not need to be told twice. She moved toward the door, stepping carefully around the pools of blood, her hands shaking as she reached for the handle. Before she could open it, Alaric spoke again. "Thank you for trying to warn me." Elowen looked back at him. This king who was both man and monster, covered in the blood of his enemies, standing alone in a room full of corpses. "You're welcome, Your Majesty." "Ah." She slipped out into the corridor and closed the door behind her. Her legs nearly gave out, and she had to lean against the wall for a moment to steady herself. The corridor was still empty, the keep still silent, as if the violence that had just occurred had been contained entirely within those chambers. She forced herself to move, to walk back toward her quarters on legs that felt like water. Bryn was waiting in Elowen's room when she returned, huddled on the bed with her eyes red from crying. She looked up when Elowen entered, relief and horror warring on her face. "You're alive," Bryn whispered. I heard screaming. I thought they'd killed you." Elowen closed the door and locked it. then sank down onto the bed beside her friend. Her hands were still shaking. "They didn't kill me. They're dead. All of them. The king? He's alive. He was never injured, Bryn. It was all a lie. A test. And tonight, he ended it." Bryn stared at her, comprehension dawning slowly. "He killed them. The counselors." "Yes. What did you see?" Elawin closed her eyes, but the image was burned into her memory. Blood and fur and silver eyes burning with inhuman rage. "Everything. I saw everything." They sat together in silence as the first light of dawn began to creep through the window. Neither of them slept. They simply waited, holding on to each other like survivors of a shipwreck, until the sounds of the keep waking began to filter through the walls. Footsteps, voices, the clang of kitchen pots and the bark of guards calling orders. Life continuing as if the world had not fundamentally changed in the darkness of the previous night. When the summons came for Elowin to return to her duties, she went without protest. Her legs were steadier now, her hands no longer shaking, though exhaustion dragged at her bones. She made her way through corridors that seemed different somehow, as if the violence of the night had left an invisible mark on the stone walls. Alaric's chambers had been cleaned. The bodies were gone. The blood had been scrubbed from the floors and walls. Fresh linens covered the bed, and the fire burned bright in the hearth. It was as if nothing had happened, except for the king himself, who sat once again in his wheelchair near the window, dressed immaculately, his expression distant as he gazed out at the snow-covered mountains. "Your Majesty," Elowin said quietly, announcing her presence. "Elowin." He did not turn to look at her. "I trust you slept well as could be expected." "Good." He finally turned, his pale eyes meeting hers. "The court will be informed this morning that a conspiracy against the crown has been uncovered and dealt with. The counselors involved met justice for their treason. There will be questions, investigations, but the matter is closed. And your recovery will continue for another few weeks, until I judge the court sufficiently stabilized. Then I will make a miraculous improvement and resume my full duties." He paused. "You'll continue your position here until that time." "As you wish, Your Majesty. We won't speak of last night again. Not to each other, and not to anyone else. What happened stays between us. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Majesty." "Then we'll continue as before." Elowin nodded and moved to begin her morning duties, but she knew that nothing would ever truly be as before. She had crossed a threshold last night, witnessed something that could not be unseen, learned a truth that could not be unlearned. Alaric was not just a king. He was something far more dangerous, far more powerful, and far more alone than she had ever imagined. And she, who had come to Blackspire Keep simply to survive, had become the keeper of his darkest secret, the witness to his violence, the one person who had seen him at his most vulnerable and his most monstrous, and had chosen to stay anyway. It terrified her, but it also gave her something she had not felt in years: purpose, recognition, the knowledge that she mattered, even if only as a witness to history being written in blood. The days that followed were strange and subdued. The court was in chaos, trying to process the sudden disappearance of 6 prominent council members, and the king's declaration that a conspiracy had been thwarted. Investigations were launched. Chambers were searched. More arrests followed. Smaller players in the plot who had been identified during the months of Alaric's surveillance. The keep buzzed with rumor and fear, everyone wondering who would be next. Who else had been marked as a traitor? Through it all, Elowin continued her duties with quiet efficiency. She served Alaric's meals, maintained his chambers, assisted with the performance of his supposed disability. But the dynamic between them had shifted irreversibly. He no longer watched her with suspicion or calculation. Instead, there was something else in his gaze, a wary respect mixed with something she could not quite name, gratitude, perhaps, or recognition of shared knowledge. 2 weeks after the purge, Alaric began to show signs of recovery. Small things at first, calculated improvements that would not seem too miraculous to draw suspicion. He requested that his meals be served at a table instead of in his lap. He spent less time in the wheelchair and more sitting in a chair by the fire. He began receiving visitors again, members of the remaining council who had proven their loyalty through the crisis. Elowen watched the performance with a mixture of admiration and unease. Alaric was masterful at maintaining the illusion, showing just enough progress to seem plausible while keeping the court convinced that his injury had been real and severe. The new council members, hastily appointed to replace those who had been executed, treated him with careful deference, aware that their positions depended entirely on the king's favor and uncertain how much he truly knew about their own activities. The keep itself had changed. The atmosphere of suffocating tension had lifted somewhat, replaced by a different kind of wariness. People understood now that King Alaric was not someone to be underestimated, that his apparent weakness had been a mask for something far more dangerous. The guards stood straighter at their posts. The servants moved through their duties with renewed diligence. Fear had been replaced by a kind of grudging respect, and Blackspire Keep felt more like what it was supposed to be, the seat of absolute power rather than a battlefield where that power was constantly contested. Bryn had grown distant. She still performed her duties, still ate meals with Elowen when their schedules aligned, but there was a carefulness to her now, as if she were afraid that proximity to Elowen meant proximity to danger. Elowen did not blame her. She understood that what she had witnessed, what she knew, set her apart from the other servants in a way that could never be bridged. She was the king's keeper of secrets now, whether she wanted to be or not. It was on a gray afternoon 3 weeks after the purge that everything changed again. Elowen was organizing Alaric's correspondence when he spoke without looking up from the report he was reading. "I'll be making a public announcement tomorrow. A full recovery." Elowen paused in her sorting. "Tomorrow? The court has been stabilized. The traitors have been removed. The southern packs have quieted down now that they understand I'm still very much in control. There's no reason to continue the charade." He set down the report and looked at her directly. "You'll be relieved of your duties as my personal attendant." Something cold settled in Elowen's chest. She had known this moment would come eventually, that her position was always temporary, but hearing it stated so plainly felt like a dismissal of something more than just employment. "I understand, Your Majesty. Will I be reassigned to other duties in the keep?" "No." Alaric stood from his chair, moving to the window with the fluid grace she had only seen once before, on the night of the killings. "You'll be given a substantial payment for your service and assistance in leaving Raventhorn Vale entirely. Enough money to start fresh somewhere far from here, somewhere safe. You're sending me away? I'm setting you free." He turned to face her, his expression difficult to read. "You've seen too much, Elowen. You know things that make you a liability. Not to me specifically, but to yourself. There are people in this court, in the packs, who would use you to get to me if they knew what you witnessed. The safest thing for both of us is for you to disappear. And if I don't want to disappear, then you're more foolish than I thought." Elowen set down the papers she had been holding, her hands steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "You're afraid." Alaric's eyes flashed. "Excuse me? Not of threats from your enemies. You've proven you can handle those. You're afraid of what it means that I know the truth, that I saw you at your most vulnerable and your most violent, and I didn't run. That scares you more than any conspiracy. You don't know what you're talking about, don't I?" Elowen took a step closer, emboldened by anger and something else, a recklessness born from weeks of suppressing everything she felt. "You've spent months lying to everyone around you, testing them, watching them, trusting no one. And then I walked into your chambers and saw through the performance, and instead of being horrified or betrayed, I tried to help you. That's not what you expected. You don't know how to handle someone who sees you clearly and doesn't either worship you or hate you. You should hate me." Alaric's voice was low, dangerous. "I killed 6 men in front of you, tore them apart with my bare hands. You should be terrified of me. I was terrified. I am terrified. But that doesn't mean I hate you." "Then what do you feel?" Elowen hesitated, trying to find words for emotions she barely understood herself. "I feel like I finally understand why you did what you did. The deception, the isolation, the violence. You were alone, surrounded by enemies, unable to trust anyone. You did what you had to do to survive and protect your kingdom. I can't hate you for that. because I've done my own version of the same thing my entire life. Your version didn't involve slaughtering people. No, but it involved letting people die. Watching my mother suffer because I couldn't afford medicine. Letting neighbors turn their backs rather than fighting for help I wouldn't get anyway. Standing by while people weaker than me were abused because speaking up would have meant starving. We all have blood on our hands, Your Majesty. Some of it's just more visible than others. Alaric stared at her, something raw and unguarded flickering across his face before he shuddered it away. You think you understand me. I think I understand what it's like to be alone, to do whatever it takes to survive, to wonder if there's any point to surviving when everyone around you sees you as either a tool or a threat. And what do you see me as? A man who's forgotten that he's allowed to be human. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Alaric turned back to the window, his shoulders tight, and when he spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled. You're still leaving. Tomorrow, after the announcement, your payment will be generous enough that you can go anywhere, start any life you want. That's my final decision. And if I refuse the money, then you're a fool, but I can't force you to take it. He glanced back at her. Why would you refuse? Because I don't want to leave. There's nothing for you here. There's nothing for me anywhere else either. At least here I have a purpose. At least here someone sees me as more than just another desperate orphan. I'm not your salvation, Elwyn. I'm not some benevolent protector who's going to take care of you. I'm a king with a kingdom to run and enemies who would use any weakness against me. You staying here makes you a target. Then teach me not to be. Alaric turned fully to face her, surprise clear on his features. What? You said people would use me to get to you. So teach me how to defend myself, how to navigate this court, how to be useful instead of vulnerable. Alawan met his gaze steadily. You need people you can trust, and trust has to start somewhere. I've already proven I can keep your secrets. Let me prove I can be more than just a liability. You have no idea what you're asking. Then tell me. Explain it. But don't send me away because you're afraid of what it means that someone finally knows the truth about you. For a long moment, Alaric said nothing. He simply looked at her with those pale, calculating eyes, and Alawan felt certain he was going to refuse, going to insist that she leave and never return. But then something shifted in his expression, a decision made. If you stay, your position changes. You won't be a servant anymore. You'll be a contracted employee, someone with official standing in the household. You'll be given better quarters, better pay, and responsibilities beyond caring for my personal needs. You'll assist me directly with correspondence, logistics, matters that require someone I can trust to handle sensitive information. Is that understood? Yes, Your Majesty. You'll also be given basic training in self-defense and court etiquette. If you're going to be visible in my inner circle, you need to know how to handle yourself. The lessons will be difficult and the expectations high. If you fail to meet them, you'll be dismissed immediately. I understand. And if at any point I decide you're more risk than benefit, you'll leave without argument and take the payment I offer. No negotiations, no appeals. Are we clear? Perfectly clear. Alaric studied her for another moment, then nodded once. Report to Mistress Caro tomorrow morning. She'll arrange your new quarters and explain your new duties. We'll discuss the training schedule once you're settled. Thank you, Your Majesty. Don't thank me yet. You may regret this decision before long. Alawan doubted that, but she simply bowed and returned to her work. The papers she had been sorting seemed trivial now compared to what had just transpired. She had gambled everything on honesty, on refusing to accept dismissal, and somehow it had worked. She was staying, not as a servant, but as something else entirely, something that scared her and exhilarated her in equal measure. That evening, when she returned to her small quarters, she found Bryn waiting outside her door. Her friend looked nervous, her hands twisted in her apron, but there was determination in her eyes. I heard, Bryn said quietly, about your new position. People are already talking. Let them talk. Alawan, do you understand what this means? You're going to be close to the king, part of his inner circle. People will watch you, use you if they can. You'll never have a moment of peace. I haven't had peace since my mother died. At least now I'll have purpose. Bryn shook her head. I don't understand you. Most people would take the money and run. Start fresh somewhere no one knows their name. But you're choosing to stay in the most dangerous place in the kingdom. Because dangerous doesn't mean meaningless. I spent years in Millhaven being invisible, being nothing. Here at least I matter, even if it's terrifying. You matter to me, Bryn said softly. You're the only friend I have here. I don't want to lose you. Alawen felt her throat tighten. She reached out and took Bryn's hand, squeezing gently. You won't lose me. My position might change, but I'm still the same person. Are you? Because from where I'm standing, you've changed a lot since you came here. Maybe that's not a bad thing. Bryn managed a small smile, though her eyes remained sad. Just promise me you'll be careful, that you won't let ambition blind you to danger. I promise. They hugged briefly, and then Bryn left, disappearing down the corridor toward her own quarters. Alawen stood alone in the hallway, feeling the weight of everything that had changed and everything that was yet to come. She had made her choice. There was no going back now. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Elowen dressed in her servant's uniform for the last time and made her way to Mistress Caro's office. The head housekeeper looked at her with an expression that was equal parts curiosity and disapproval. So you're the one causing all this commotion, Mistress Caro said, gesturing for Elowen to sit. The king has given specific instructions regarding your new position. You're to be housed in the West Wing, where the king's advisors and senior staff reside. Your duties will include managing certain aspects of His Majesty's correspondence, maintaining records of sensitive meetings, and serving as a liaison between the king and various departments within the keep. I understand. Do you? Mistress Caro's gaze was sharp. This isn't a promotion based on merit or experience. This is the king taking a personal interest in your welfare for reasons he hasn't fully explained. That makes you both privileged and vulnerable. People will assume you have influence you may not actually possess. They'll try to use you to get messages to the king, to gain favor, to gather information. You'll need to learn very quickly how to navigate those waters without drowning. I'm a fast learner. You'll need to be. Mistress Caro handed her a key. These are for your new quarters. You'll move your belongings today. Lessons in court etiquette will begin tomorrow morning with Lady Thessa, one of the senior advisors. Self-defense training will begin the day after with Captain Voss of the King's Guard. Do not be late for either. I won't. And Alawen? Mistress Caro's expression softened slightly. Whatever relationship you think you have with the king, remember that he is still a king. He's not your friend, not your protector, and certainly not your equal. The moment you forget that is the moment you become a liability. Understood? Yes, ma'am. Alawen took the key and left, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and fear. The West Wing was a part of the keep she had only seen in passing, where the important members of Alaric's household lived in quarters that spoke of status and privilege. Her new room was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a corridor lined with doors bearing names etched on brass plates. The room itself was 3 times the size of her servants' quarters, with a real bed instead of a cot, a writing desk, a wardrobe, and a window that looked out over the courtyard. There were fresh linens on the bed, oil lamps already filled and ready to light, and a small chest at the foot of the bed that contained clothing far nicer than anything she had ever owned. Dresses in wool and linen, sturdy but well made, appropriate for someone of her new station. Elowen set down her small bundle of belongings, her mother's wedding ring still hanging around her neck, and looked around at the space that was now hers. It felt surreal, like stepping into someone else's life. She had come to Blackspire Keep expecting to scrub floors and empty chamber pots, to be invisible and replaceable. Instead, she had become something else entirely. Visible, important, dangerous. She spent the day moving her few possessions and learning the layout of the West Wing. The corridors were warmer here, better maintained, with carpets on the floors and tapestries on the walls. The other residents nodded to her when they passed, some with curiosity, others with thinly veiled suspicion. Alawen kept her head high and her expression neutral, refusing to be cowed by their scrutiny. That evening, a summons came for her to join Alaric in his study, a room adjacent to his chambers that she had never entered before. She found him seated at a large desk covered in maps and documents, dressed in formal attire for the first time since she had known him. He looked up when she entered, his expression unreadable. "How are your new quarters?" he asked. "Generous, Your Majesty." "Thank you. You'll earn them." He gestured to a chair across from his desk. "Sit. We need to discuss the parameters of your new position." Alawan sat, acutely aware of how different this felt from their previous interactions. There was no wheelchair between them now, no performance of weakness. Just two people facing each other across a desk, negotiating the terms of an alliance neither of them fully understood yet. "You'll be given access to certain information," Alaric began. "Trade agreements, territorial disputes, pack politics. Nothing classified at the highest level, but sensitive enough that disclosure could cause problems. Your job will be to organize this information, track patterns, and bring relevant details to my attention. Do you have experience with record keeping?" "Some. I kept accounts for my father's smithy before he died." "Good. You'll expand on that. I'll also need you to screen requests for audience, determine which ones are worth my time and which can be handled by others. You'll need to develop an understanding of court politics quickly. Learn who's reliable and who's looking for advantage." "How will I know the difference?" "You won't at first. You'll make mistakes. The key is learning from them quickly." He leaned back in his chair. "I'm taking a risk with you, Elowen. Not just by keeping you here, but by giving you real responsibility. People will question my judgment. They'll assume you're here because of some personal entanglement rather than competence. Are they wrong?" "Partially. Yes, there's a personal element. You've earned my trust in a way few people have. But I also need people who can think independently, who aren't so bound by court politics that they can't see clearly. You have that advantage because you're an outsider. Use it." "I will. One more thing." Alaric's expression grew serious. "Tomorrow's announcement will be public and significant. I'll be revealing my full recovery, which means acknowledging that my injury was less severe than believed. There will be questions, speculation about why I spent months pretending to be more injured than I was. The official explanation is that I was testing the loyalty of my court following reports of conspiracy. Most people will accept that. Some won't. You may be caught in the fallout. I can handle it. We'll see." He stood, and Elowen rose as well. "The announcement is at midday in the throne room. You're expected to attend as part of my official household. Wear one of the dresses provided in your quarters. And Alawan." "Yes, Your Majesty. Don't make me regret this." "I won't." She left the study and returned to her new quarters, her mind racing. Tomorrow everything would change again, this time publicly and irrevocably. Alaric would reclaim his full authority as king, and she would step into a role that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. She thought of her mother, who had always told her that survival meant adapting, changing, becoming whatever the situation required. Elowen had survived Millhaven by becoming invisible. She had survived her first weeks at Blackspire Keep by being useful and unremarkable. Now she would have to survive by being visible, by standing in the light of royal scrutiny and proving herself worthy of trust that had been given but not yet earned. She lay in her new bed that night, too anxious to sleep, staring at the ceiling and wondering if she had made the right choice. It would have been so much easier to take the money and leave, to start fresh somewhere safe and anonymous. But ease had never been her goal. Purpose had. Meaning had. The chance to be something more than just another desperate girl trying not to starve. And she had found that here, in the most unlikely place imaginable. In the service of a king who was both man and monster, who had lied to his entire court and killed his enemies without mercy, but who had also seen her as more than a servant, who had given her a choice when he could have simply dismissed her, who frightened her and fascinated her in equal measure. Alawan closed her eyes and tried to sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring challenges she could not yet imagine. But she was ready. Or as ready as anyone could be when stepping into a world of power and politics with nothing but determination and a dead mother's wedding ring around her neck. The morning of the announcement arrived with crystalline clarity. Alawan dressed carefully in one of the new dresses, a deep gray wool with silver embroidery at the cuffs and collar. It fit well, tailored specifically for her frame, and when she looked at herself in the small mirror on the wall, She barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked competent, professional, like someone who belonged in the king's household rather than someone who had stumbled into it by accident. She made her way to the throne room an hour before the scheduled announcement, wanting to observe the preparations and understand the atmosphere. The room was already filling with nobles and officials, all dressed in their finest, all buzzing with speculation about what the king would announce. Elowyn found a position near the back of the dais, where the king's household staff would stand during formal proceedings, and waited. When Alaric entered, the room fell silent. He walked without assistance, his stride confident and strong, dressed in the formal regalia of his office. The wheelchair was nowhere to be seen. He climbed the steps to the throne with easy grace and stood before his assembled court, his presence commanding absolute attention. 3 months ago, Alaric began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. I survived an attempt on my life. Not through violence, but through subterfuge and poison administered by those I trusted. The effects were debilitating, and I made the decision to allow my enemies to believe they had succeeded in weakening me beyond recovery. What followed was a careful investigation that revealed the depth of conspiracy against the crown, conspiracy that has now been completely eliminated. A murmur ran through the crowd. This was not the story they had been told before. Not exactly. Alaric was rewriting the narrative, making his deception seem less like paranoid testing and more like strategic necessity. The traitors who sought to destabilize this kingdom have been dealt with. Those who remained loyal have been rewarded. And now, having restored order and security, I resume my full duties as your king. The period of uncertainty is over. Raventhorn Vale stands united and strong. The court erupted in carefully orchestrated applause, though Elowyn could see the calculation in many faces, people reassessing alliances and strategies in light of this new information. Alaric had managed to turn his deception into a victory, proof of his cunning rather than admission of weakness. As the applause died down, Alaric's gaze swept the room and landed briefly on Elowyn. Their eyes met for just a moment, and she saw something there that might have been acknowledgement or perhaps warning. Then his attention moved on, and the moment passed. The announcement continued with formal business, appointments, and proclamations, but Elowyn barely heard them. She was watching the court, seeing how they reacted to their newly restored king, noting who seemed relieved and who seemed worried. This was her education now, learning to read the subtle currents of power that flowed through Blackspire Keep. When the proceedings finally ended, Elowyn made her way back to her quarters through corridors full of people discussing the announcement in hushed, urgent tones. No one stopped her or questioned her, though many eyes followed her passage. She was visible now, marked as part of the king's inner circle, and that visibility came with weight she was only beginning to understand. Her education had begun, and there would be no going back. The weeks that followed were the most challenging of Elowyn's life. Lady Thessa, the advisor assigned to teach her court etiquette, was a severe woman in her 60s with no patience for mistakes. She drilled Elowyn relentlessly on forms of address, proper behavior during formal functions, the complex web of alliances and grudges that defined Blackspire Keep's social hierarchy. Elowyn's head spun with names and titles, with rules about who could speak to whom and when, with the subtle language of gestures and seating arrangements that could mean the difference between insult and diplomacy. Captain Voss, who handled her combat training, was equally demanding. He was a massive werewolf with scars crossing his face and arms, a veteran of countless battles who saw Elowyn's human frailty as both a challenge and an opportunity. He taught her not to fight like a warrior, which would be impossible, but to fight like someone who understood her disadvantages and compensated accordingly. Where to strike to cause maximum damage, how to use an opponent's strength against them, when to run, and how to do it effectively. You'll never beat a werewolf in a fair fight, Voss told her bluntly during their third session, after she had been thrown to the mat for the 10th time. So don't fight fair, fight smart, fight dirty, and most importantly, don't be where they expect you to be. Elowyn learned. Her body ached constantly, muscles protesting the new demands placed on them. Her mind felt stuffed with information, struggling to retain the endless lessons about court politics and pack dynamics. But she persevered, driven by the knowledge that failure meant dismissal, and dismissal meant losing the only purpose she had found since her mother's death. Her work in Alaric's study became routine. She arrived each morning to find correspondence waiting for her, letters from nobles and merchants, pack leaders and foreign dignitaries. She organized them by priority, flagged the ones that required immediate attention, and prepared summaries of the less urgent matters. Alaric reviewed her work with a critical eye, sometimes praising her efficiency, more often pointing out things she had missed or misjudged. "This letter from the Silverwood pack," he said one morning, tapping the parchment with one finger. "You marked it as low priority. Why?" "It's a request for reduced tariffs on timber exports. Standard negotiation. Nothing urgent. Look at the signature again." Alawan studied the letter more carefully. The signature was elaborate, but beneath it was a small seal she had not noticed before. A crescent moon partially obscured by a tree. What does that mean? It means the letter isn't really about tariffs. It's a coded message requesting a private meeting. The Silverwood pack has information they don't want to transmit in writing. Alaric set the letter aside. "Always look for what's not being said, Alawan. The obvious message is often a distraction from the real one." She learned to look deeper, to question her assumptions, to consider motives beyond the surface. It was exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure, this constant exercise in reading between lines and anticipating hidden agendas. She made mistakes, sometimes embarrassing ones, but Alaric was surprisingly patient with her ignorance, understanding that she was learning an entirely new language in real time. The court's reaction to her presence was mixed. Some members of the household treated her with cautious respect, recognizing that she had the king's trust, and therefore warranted careful handling. Others were openly contemptuous, viewing her as an upstart human who had somehow manipulated her way into a position far above her station. Alawan endured both reactions with the same neutral composure, refusing to be baited by hostility or seduced by false flattery. It was during her 6th week in the new position that she encountered her first real test. A delegation from the Iron Peak Pack arrived at Blackspire Keep, ostensibly to discuss trade agreements, but actually to assess whether the rumors of Alaric's recovery were true, and whether he was still fit to lead. Alawan was assigned to manage their accommodations and ensure their stay proceeded smoothly, a task that seemed simple until she realized that every interaction, every small detail, was being scrutinized as evidence of the king's competence and control. The delegation leader was a woman named Kira, tall and imposing, with silver-streaked hair and eyes that seemed to see through every polite lie. She tested Alawan immediately, making unreasonable demands and watching carefully to see how they were handled. "The quarters you've assigned us are inadequate," Kira announced upon arrival. "We require rooms in the East Wing, with direct access to the training grounds." Alawan kept her expression neutral. "The East Wing is reserved for the king's immediate family and the highest-ranking pack leaders. As honored guests, you've been given excellent accommodations in the North Wing, which features private dining facilities and direct access to the library. Are you suggesting the Iron Peak Pack doesn't rank high enough for the East Wing?" It was a trap, an attempt to create an insult where none existed. Alawan recognized it immediately from Lady Thessa's lessons. "I'm suggesting that the North Wing was selected specifically because it offers privacy and comfort without placing you in the middle of the keep's administrative center, where constant traffic would disturb your rest. However, if you prefer the noise and activity of the East Wing, I can certainly arrange a transfer." Kira's eyes narrowed slightly, reassessing. "The North Wing will be acceptable." The visit continued in similar fashion, Kira probing for weakness while Alawan deflected with careful courtesy. By the 3rd day, the delegation leader's demeanor had shifted from hostile testing to something closer to grudging approval. On the final evening of their stay, as Alawan was organizing documents in the study, Alaric called her over. "The Iron Peak delegation is leaving tomorrow," he said. "Kira requested a private word with me this afternoon. She wanted to know where I had found you." "What did you tell her?" "That you were highly recommended by someone whose judgment I trust." A slight smile touched his lips. She said you handled their visit with more skill than some of his senior advisors, and that if I ever decided I didn't need you, Iron Peak would be happy to offer you a position. Elowen blinked in surprise. She was testing me the entire time. Of course she was. That's what these visits are about. They're not really here to discuss trade. They're here to measure our strength, our organization, our attention to detail. You passed. Impressively. I made mistakes. Several times I wasn't sure if I was handling things correctly. But you recovered well, and you never let her see uncertainty. That's what matters. Alaric leaned back in his chair, studying her. You've adapted faster than I expected. Most people take months to learn what you've managed in weeks. I had good motivation. Failure meant dismissal. And now? Do you still feel like you're one mistake away from being sent away? Elowen considered the question honestly. No. Now I feel like I'm one mistake away from causing a diplomatic incident or getting someone killed. Alaric laughed, a genuine sound that Elowen had rarely heard from him. That's actually an improvement. It means you understand the stakes. As autumn deepened into winter, Elowen found her place within the strange ecosystem of Blackspire Keep. She was neither servant nor noble, neither werewolf nor completely powerless. She existed in a liminal space, trusted with significant responsibility, but always aware of how quickly that trust could be revoked. She learned to navigate the court's complex social dynamics, to identify allies and threats, to speak carefully and observe constantly. Her relationship with Alaric evolved in subtle ways. The formal distance that had characterized their early interactions gradually gave way to something more complex. He began asking her opinion on matters beyond simple logistics, testing her judgment on policy decisions and political strategy. She found herself spending long evenings in his study, discussing everything from pack relations to economic reform, debates that sometimes grew heated but never hostile. "You're too idealistic," Alaric told her one night after she had argued passionately for reducing taxes on the poorest territories. "You see suffering and want to fix it immediately. But governance doesn't work that way. Every decision has consequences, ripples that spread in ways you can't always predict. So we do nothing because doing something might cause problems?" Elowen shot back. "People are starving in the border towns. Reducing their tax burden wouldn't destabilize anything except the treasury, and even that could be offset by increasing tariffs on luxury goods. And then the merchants who deal in luxury goods lobby the council, claiming economic hardship, and suddenly I'm dealing with a completely different crisis." He sighed. "I'm not saying you're wrong about what needs to happen. I'm saying the path to getting there is more complicated than you think. Then teach me the complications. Help me understand why my solutions won't work instead of just dismissing them." Alaric looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his expression. "You don't defer to authority easily, do you? I defer when authority has earned it, when it's backed by reason rather than just position. That attitude will get you in trouble eventually. It already has. Multiple times. I'm still here." Another laugh, softer this time. "Yes, you are." It was during one of these evening discussions, 3 months into her new position, that everything shifted again. They had been debating trade agreements with the Southern Pacts when Alaric suddenly set down the document he was holding and looked at her directly. "Why did you really choose to stay?" he asked. "You could have taken the money and started fresh somewhere safe. Built a quiet life far from politics and danger. Why risk everything to remain here?" Elowen had asked herself the same question countless times. She set down her own papers and met his gaze. "Because for the first time in my life, I felt like I mattered. Not as someone's daughter or someone's servant, but as myself. You saw me, not what I could do for you or what role I could fill, but actually saw me. And that was worth more than safety. You barely knew me then. You'd witnessed me kill 6 people. Most humans would have run. Most humans hadn't spent 3 years watching their mother die slowly while the world turned its back. I learned early that the monsters aren't always the obvious ones. Sometimes the real cruelty comes from indifference, from systems that let people suffer because helping them is inconvenient." She paused. "You're brutal when you need to be, but you're not indifferent. You care about this kingdom, about the people in it, even if you hide it behind cold calculation. You give me too much credit. Do I? You could have purged half the court after the conspiracy, executed anyone with even distant connections to the traitors. Instead, you were surgical, removing only those actually guilty. You could have abandoned the border territories to starve while focusing on the wealthy centers. Instead, you're here, late at night, trying to figure out how to help them without destabilizing everything else. That's not the behavior of someone who doesn't care. Alaric was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. You see things in me that I'm not sure are actually there. Or maybe you've spent so long pretending to be cold and unfeeling that you've forgotten you're allowed to be anything else. He stood abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked the darkened courtyard. Elowen waited, uncertain whether she had pushed too far. When he spoke again, he didn't turn around. After my father died and I took the throne, there were 3 separate attempts to overthrow me in the first 2 years. Not political maneuvering, but actual armed insurrection. I put them down, executed the leaders, and learned that showing any weakness, any vulnerability, was an invitation for people to try again. So I became what they feared instead of what they respected. I built walls so high that no one could see over them, including myself sometimes. And then you staged your own injury to test those walls. Yes, and discovered that most of them were already crumbling, held together by fear rather than loyalty. The conspiracy was worse than I had imagined, deeper and more widespread. If I hadn't acted when I did, I would have been dead within months. He finally turned to face her. You came into my life at the moment when I trusted no one and nothing, when I was surrounded by enemies and convinced that isolation was the only path to survival. And you refused to let me stay isolated. I didn't think I had that much influence. You didn't think you had any influence. That's what made you trustworthy. You weren't trying to manipulate me or position yourself for advantage. You were just being honest, even when honesty was dangerous. He moved closer, and Elowen's pulse quickened. Do you understand what you've become to me? No, she admitted quietly. Neither do I. That's what scares me. The air between them felt charged, heavy with things unspoken. Elowen knew she should step back, maintain the professional distance that had defined their relationship, but she couldn't make herself move. She had spent months learning to read Alaric, to understand the man beneath the crown, and what she saw now was vulnerability so raw it made her chest ache. I'm not afraid of you, she said softly. I never was. Not really. You should be. I'm dangerous, Elowen. To my enemies, to anyone who threatens what I've built, and potentially to you if you get too close. Then teach me how to survive that danger. You've taught me everything else. Alaric reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. His touch was gentle, almost tentative, so different from the ruthless king she had seen execute traitors without hesitation. If this goes wrong, if people perceive you as a weakness, they'll use you against me. They'll hurt you to hurt me. Are you prepared for that? Are you prepared for the alternative? Spending the rest of your life alone because you're too afraid to let anyone close? I've been alone for years. I know how to survive it. Surviving isn't the same as living. He kissed her then. A kiss that tasted of desperation and longing, and years of self-imposed isolation finally cracking. Elowen responded without thinking, her hands finding his shoulders, pulling him closer. All the careful professionalism, all the formal distance they had maintained, shattered in that moment, revealing what had been building beneath it for months. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Alaric rested his forehead against hers. This complicates everything. I know. The court will assume I've been manipulating you, that I brought you here for this purpose rather than any legitimate reason. Let them assume. We know the truth. The truth doesn't always matter in politics. Then we make it matter. Elowen pulled back slightly to look at him directly. You spent months lying to the court about your injury. Surely you can handle lying about when this started. Despite everything, he smiled. You're suggesting we deceive people about the nature of our relationship? I'm suggesting we control the narrative. Tell them whatever keeps you safe and keeps me useful. The reality is ours alone. When did you become so calculating? I had a good teacher. Alaric kissed her again, softer this time, and Elowyn felt something settle in her chest that she had not felt since before her mother's death. Not quite peace, but something close. Purpose and connection, and the knowledge that she was no longer facing the world entirely alone. They spent that night together, talking and planning and occasionally surrendering to the connection that had been building between them for months. By dawn, they had crafted a story that would protect them both. A careful fiction about a developing relationship that had begun recently rather than months ago, that was based on mutual respect rather than any impropriety during her time as his attendant. It was a lie, but a necessary one, designed to shield them from accusations of manipulation or abuse of power. When Elowyn returned to her quarters that morning, she found Bryn waiting outside her door, eyes wide with concern. "You didn't come back last night," Bryn said. "I was worried." Elowyn unlocked her door and gestured for her friend to come inside. "I'm fine. Better than fine, actually." "Where were you?" "With the king." Bryn's eyes went wider. "Elowyn, tell me you didn't." "I did. And before you lecture me about danger and foolishness, I know. I know all the risks. I know how this looks and what people will say. But Bryn, I've spent my entire life being careful and safe and invisible, and it got me nothing but poverty and grief. I'm not doing that anymore. This isn't about being careful. This is about survival. If the court decides you're a threat or a liability, they'll destroy you. Then I'll have to make sure they don't see me as either." Elowyn sat down on her bed, suddenly exhausted. "I love him, Bryn. I don't know when it happened or how, but I do. And he loves me, even if he's terrified to admit it. That's worth fighting for." Bryn sat down beside her, taking her hand. "Then I'll help you fight. But please, please be careful. Promise me." "I promise." The weeks that followed required careful navigation. Alaric and Elowyn maintained strict professionalism in public, giving no indication that their relationship had changed. In private, they allowed themselves to be honest, to be vulnerable, to explore the connection that had developed in the spaces between duty and survival. It was complicated and sometimes painful, balancing the demands of his position with the reality of their feelings. But they managed. The court eventually noticed, of course. Rumors began to circulate about the king's human advisor, speculation about whether she had more influence than her position suggested. Lady Thessa approached Elowyn one afternoon with a warning disguised as advice. "Be very careful," she said quietly. "There are people who see any attachment the king forms as an opportunity. They'll try to use you, and if that doesn't work, they'll try to remove you. Watch your back." "I will. Thank you. And Elowyn? Don't let anyone make you ashamed of what you've found. True connection is rare enough that it should be protected, regardless of what form it takes." It was the closest thing to approval Elowyn had received from anyone in the court, and it steadied her for the challenges ahead. Because challenges did come. A rival pack sent an envoy specifically to test Elowyn's influence, to see if she could be manipulated into swaying the king's decisions. She handled it with the skill she had learned, deflecting their attempts while gathering information about their true objectives that proved valuable in later negotiations. A member of the council tried to spread rumors that Elowyn was using some form of magic to control the king's mind, a baseless accusation that nevertheless required careful dismantling. Alaric dealt with it publicly, calling out the counselor in open court and demanding evidence for such serious claims. When none could be provided, the counselor was censured and his credibility destroyed. Through it all, Elowyn and Alaric grew closer, learning to trust not just each other, but the partnership they were building. She brought humanity and empathy to his decisions, tempering his tendency toward ruthless efficiency with consideration for the people affected. He gave her protection and purpose, a platform from which her ideas could actually create change, rather than dying unheard in the poverty of Millhaven. 6 months after the purge, Alaric made a public announcement that sent shockwaves through Blackspire Keep. He declared Elowyn his official consort, a position that granted her formal recognition and protection under law. It was a bold move, claiming a human as consort when tradition demanded a werewolf mate. But Alaric faced the court's objections with the same cold authority that had kept him on the throne through multiple crises. Elowen Hartley has proven herself invaluable to this kingdom, he stated flatly. Her intelligence, integrity, and dedication have earned my trust and my respect. Anyone who questions that trust questions my judgment, and I will deal with such questions accordingly. The implicit threat silenced most objections, though whispers continued in corners and behind closed doors. Elowen wore her new position with the same determined grace she had brought to everything else, refusing to be diminished by those who saw her as unworthy. The first year of their official partnership passed in a blur of work and adaptation. Elowen learned to balance her role as advisor with her position as consort, navigating the complex expectations each role carried. She instituted reforms in the border territories, programs that provided support for orphans and widows, ensuring that no one would suffer the way she had in Millhaven. Alaric supported her initiatives, providing resources and authority while teaching her to anticipate resistance and plan accordingly. They were not without conflict. Alaric's tendency toward cold calculation sometimes clashed with Elowen's emotional investment in outcomes. She pushed him to be more transparent with the court, to trust more readily. He pushed her to be more cautious, to recognize that not every problem could be solved with good intentions. But they learned to argue constructively, to challenge each other without breaking the fundamental trust that underlay their partnership. It was on a winter evening 2 years after Elowen had first arrived at Blackspire Keep that Alaric found her standing at the window of their shared chambers, looking out at the snow-covered mountains. He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking?" he asked quietly. "About how much has changed. About the girl who came here desperate and terrified, willing to do anything to survive. You were never just desperate. You were strong, determined. I saw that from the beginning. You saw a useful tool. At first, maybe, but not for long." He turned her to face him. "You changed me, Elowen. Made me remember that strength doesn't have to mean isolation. That trust is possible, even in a world full of threats. And you gave me purpose, a reason to be more than just someone trying not to die. We saved each other." "Yes," she agreed softly. "We did." Alaric had spent years building walls to protect himself, learning to rule through fear rather than loyalty, convinced that isolation was the price of power. But Elowen had seen through those walls, had refused to let him hide behind them, and in doing so had given him something he had not believed possible. Not just love, though that was part of it, but partnership. True partnership, where vulnerability was not weakness, but strength. For Elowen, who had spent most of her life invisible and powerless, Blackspire Keep had become something she never expected. Not just a refuge, but a home. Not just survival, but a life worth living. She had come seeking only the means to exist, and she had found purpose, love, and the knowledge that she was capable of far more than she had ever imagined. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be challenges, threats, moments when everything they had built seemed fragile and uncertain. But they would face those moments together. Two people who had learned that survival was not the opposite of living, but often the beginning of it. Outside, snow continued to fall on Raventhorn Vale, blanketing the world in white silence. And inside, Blackspire Keep, in chambers that had once held only loneliness and suspicion, a king and his consort stood together, having found in each other what neither had thought to seek. Not salvation or completion, but something better and more real. A partnership forged in honesty, strengthened by trust, and sustained by the simple, radical choice to be vulnerable with someone who had earned it. Years later, when historians recorded the reign of King Alaric Thorn, they would note the reforms he instituted, the peace he maintained, the prosperity that marked his rule. But those who knew him best understood that his greatest achievement was not political or military. It was learning to trust again, to love again, to understand that true power lay not in isolation, but in connection, not in fear, but in freely given loyalty. And for Elowen, whose story began in poverty and grief, whose survival seemed uncertain more times than she could count, the ending was neither triumph nor tragedy, but something more valuable. It was simply a life, fully lived, alongside someone who saw her clearly and loved her anyway. That was enough. More than enough. That was everything. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales. Leave a like if this touched your heart, and comment below telling us which city you're listening from.